Hello guys, my name is Alex. I run an urbanism YouTube channel named City for All, and Reese has kindly invited me to present it here. I have some experience in urban planning myself, which I'm going to share in the future, and for now the videos on my channel are divided into three main groups. The most active one is weekly urban news, in which I talk about various interesting events related to the city development around the world, who bought new trams, where a new metro line, bicycle path, park or some iconic building was opened, and so on. So if you wanna follow such news, I invite you to visit my channel on Sundays. I try to cover the widest geography possible, and I am always grateful to viewers for their suggestions in the comments, so feel free to write about interesting events from your city if you want them to be included in my episodes. Also, I make thematic videos about various fundamental things important for understanding sustainable urban development, such as approaches to financing public transport, advantages of trams and trolleybuses, or benefits of green tram tracks. And one more type of videos on my channel is stories about the realization of different urban projects. For example, how a bicycle path appeared on the site of abandoned railway in Wuppertal, Germany, how trolleybuses were suspended in Wellington, New Zealand, or how Mendoza, Argentina launched a tram service using the remains of its abandoned rail tracks. And now I guess it's time to invite you to watch one of my favorite videos explaining why your city needs a tram. Today we will discuss trams. This topic is very up-to-date because as soon as you mention them, someone will surely say that a tram is an outdated and unreliable thing that should be eliminated years ago. But first we need to clarify the terms, cause when we say tram, each of us means something different and this leads to misunderstandings. That's why we need a little historical background. In general, public transport which moved on rails along city streets appeared in the second half of the 19th century. These were small wagons that were first pulled by horses, and then they started using electric traction. The very first to realize this idea was a native Ukrainian engineer Fedor Pirotsky. The world's first regular line was launched in 1881 in Berlin and was based on the ideas of Pirotsky, with whom its author Karl Heinrich von Siemens was personally familiar. These tiny wagons quickly became popular around the world and were given different names in various countries. In Europe they were actually called trams, except for example German-speaking countries where they are called Straßenbahn, which means street rail, while in the United States the same wagons were called either streetcar or trolley, which referred to wagons with the electric trolley poles like this. Although the system in San Diego is also called trolley. I give up. Anyway, so there still may be confusion in the US between this and regular trolleybuses, which are sometimes called trackless trolley. After the Second World War, many countries began a very intense destruction of tram systems, and the words tram and streetcar itself, thanks to an aggressive PR campaign of car manufacturers, has gained a reputation as an outdated rudiment that should be left behind. But there were also countries such as Germany and Switzerland where trams were preserved and modernized over the years. First they began to be connected into trains of several wagons, then these wagons became multi-sectional, then they received dedicated lanes, became low floor, received a dynamic design, and as a result this gradually transformed into this. It's still called a tram, although compared to its ancestors it's a brand new level of quality and convenience. At the same time, some countries that have once abandoned the tram realized that it was a mistake and decided to restore it, but with a new quality, and France is playing a major role here. In fact, they reinvented the tram by bringing together all the best practices, adding their own ideas and making it a new standard. And it was not only about the trams themselves, which had to be multi-sectional, low floor and with a bright design, but also about the integrated redevelopment of the street streets. On renovated streets, tram had full priority with completely separated lanes, while the number of car lanes was reduced. In addition to this, there were inclusive stops, green tracks, and massive planting of new trees and bushes. So tram became not just a new participant in street traffic, but literally a driver of rethinking the street space. The first cities to restore trams in France were Nantes and Grenoble, and then a real tram renaissance began in Europe and in the world. And it was in many ways a marketing story. The tram needed to create a new attractive identity, and for this it needed a new name that would not overlap with the old reputation of a slow and outdated box on rails. That's why in many countries trams built by modern standards are now called LRT, light rail transit. For example, in the United States, if a tram system has dedicated lanes and priority, it's no longer an outdated streetcar, but a new modern LRT. Well, in most cases. Although the quality of street space there still not reached the French standard. In the United States, everything looks far less nice, and their LRT looks more like a railway than a city tram. At the same time, they still continue to build trams, meaning streetcars using the old approach when short wagons slowly travel along the streets with cars wagging between the lanes, standing in traffic and carrying 300 passengers daily. For me, that's a real mystery. Why would you invest in obviously slow and inefficient transportation, but for some reason Americans do it. In fact, streetcars in the United States exist not to transport passengers, but rather for decoration and as an attraction for tourists from neighboring tramless cities. Moreover, some cities have both LRT and streetcars, which are often separate systems with their own organizational structures, names, and even branding. And there are also cases such as Porto, Portugal, where the LRT system is called the metro for the greater credibility, although it operates entirely tram wagons the same as in Strasbourg, and most of the tracks run on street level with a small tunnel just in the city center. And a special story are the low-income countries, for example, some former post-Soviet ones. Trams there were mostly not destroyed all at once as in the United States, although some tried very hard. But in many cases, due to the lack of money or understanding, they didn't invest in developing or even regular maintenance at all, so both wagons and infrastructure gradually reached a state of hug and cry. As a result, the trams are barely crawling, shaking and rattling on the twisted rails, running off them and constantly breaking down. Things have become so miserable that residents are often not against eliminating such trams because they are just scary to ride. And it's quite natural when having such a bad experience, people write comments about an outdated and unreliable tram because they have never seen anything else in their lives. So let's all agree that when I say the word tram, I mean its normal modern version and not this one. One of the main arguments against trams is often the price. Well, there's no arguing with that because running a tram is indeed a lot more expensive than running a bus. Captain Obvious agree with that. To run a bus route, you only need buses themselves, money for fuel, drivers, maintenance staff, and a depot to repair them. And you can also add some money to arrange bus stops. And that's all in general. There is no need to build streets on purpose because they already exist. Although if we decide to make dedicated lanes for our buses, this will entail additional costs. With the trams, everything is more complicated though. In addition to the previous points, each of which will be more expensive by itself, you also have to add the cost for laying tracks, installing contact wires, power substations, and not to forget the budget for their maintenance. And this is a pretty big part of expenses. So it is obvious that financial barrier to unlock the tram option for the mayor of default city is much higher than for a bus or trolleybus. And before starting this game, each city should weigh its financial capabilities very carefully, and if there is any doubt that it will be possible to maintain it all in good condition, then it may be better not to start. After all, a good bus or trolleybus is better than a bad tram. But if historically your city already has a tram and the city authorities are thinking about whether it would be better to abandon it, then keep in mind that it would be much more difficult and expensive to rebuild it from scratch than to gradually modernize the existing system. And it will most likely have to be rebuilt because, after all, the tram has its advantages over buses, which we'll discuss further. The cost of building a new tram line can be very different depending on the country and the project's complexity. From what I found, the cheapest new line was in Mendoza, Argentina, which cost an average of 1.76 million euros per kilometer, and the most expensive one was in Utsunomiya, Japan, with almost 30 million euros. But in most cases, modern tram systems cost between 10 to 15 million euros per kilometer. Such examples can be found in Poland or, for example, in Finland. For the complete picture, let's also compare the prices of subway construction. The cheapest subway found was in Algeria with 49 million euros per kilometer, and the most expensive one in San Francisco, where the latest network extension cost an absolutely insane 649 million euros per kilometer. Whoa! And between these two extremes there are dozens of other examples with prices around 100 million euros. These figures are also proven by the German Association of Transport Companies, according to which a new tram line costs an average of 10 to 20 million euros per kilometer, and a metro line costs between 100 and 250 million euros. So, on average, construction of a metro line costs 10 times more than a tram line. The situation with the rolling stock is similar, although the difference is not so great. The price of a modern multi-section tram ranges from 1.7 to 5 million euros per unit, while a new subway train can be purchased for between 7 and 19 million euros per train. By the way, buses and electric buses cost from 100,000 to a million euros, each depending on their type, size and complexity. So, in short, a modern tram is far more expensive than a bus, but much cheaper than a subway. So, why should we spend money on trams when we can just buy buses? Modern trams have the highest passenger capacity among all street transport. For example, a standard 12-meter bus or a trolleybus can carry about 100 passengers. An 18-meter articulated unit about 150, and the largest thing existing in the world today is 3-section buses and trolleybuses with a capacity around 200 passengers, and I suppose this is already the maximum. While modern multi-section trams, depending on their length, can carry up to 300 to 400 passengers, and the longest ones able to move even more than 500. That means that the line with articulated buses running at 5-minute headway can move 1800 passengers per hour, while a tram line, even with not the longest wagons, can easily carry 2 times more. And if you use trams like those in Budapest, the line's capacity will increase even more. Apart from the high passenger capacity of tram lines, it is also valuable that it can be easily adjusted to meet the city needs. As passenger traffic increases, single wagons can be coupled together into systems that multiply the line's capacity without changing the schedule or requiring more drivers. In some cities, you can even find systems of 4 wagons with a total length of more than 100 meters and a capacity of about 1000 passengers. In fact, the length of such tram systems is limited only by the ability to build stops of the required length. Moreover, the passenger capacity can be adjusted even during a day. At rush hour you can run long coupled systems, and in the middle of a day when there are not so many passengers, you can replace them with a shorter single units and save electricity. With buses, it won't work that way. If a bus route is no longer able to cope with the demand, the only way out is to put more buses on it. That means hiring more drivers and increase the service frequency, which can't be done indefinitely. And big cities in Latin America, such as Bogota, are very aware of this problem. First, they invented bus rapid transit. a kind of low-cost tram with multi-section buses instead of trams, but then they face the fact that buses very quickly hit the ceiling of their capabilities, which is very difficult to jump above, and still had to think about something more serious and spend money again. And currently Bogota is already building the first subway line, which it plans to launch in 2028. The path of trams is strictly fixed by metro rails. Of course, someone might say this means it can't maneuver around obstacles, and that's true. But the other thing is that it allows us to predict its dimensions at every turn and on every street down to the centimeter. And what is especially important, it doesn't depend on its length, and even if the tram is 100 meters long, its tail will follow the head perfectly. It makes possible to use urban space more efficiently and not waste it on wide buffer zones. For example, you can make smaller margins to poles and other street objects, place oncoming tracks more tightly, and use the saved space for wider sidewalks, additional landscaping, bike lanes, and even car parking spaces. And this is especially valuable in dense historical areas. It is also a great advantage for pedestrian zones with a public transport. A tram is ideal for such cases because everyone around can clearly see its path, understand how to behave, and feel safe. Unlike trams, buses and trolleybuses, especially multi-sectional ones, require much more space, especially when turning. Also, tram drivers don't have to rotate the steering wheel, estimate the path around every corner, and make sure it fits in. They just have to choose the right speed. As a result, trams can drive quickly and confidently in places where bus and trolleybus drivers would have to slow down and use all their skills. Another major tram benefit is that it can provide much better accessibility. Based on track layout and the wagon size, the height and position of the platform can be calculated to the millimeter so that the entrance to the wagon will be completely barrier-free. Then people in wheelchairs will be able to use trams without any assistance, and unlike the subway, they will not need to go underground to do so. This means using public transportation will be as easy as possible. And what's also important, it will be stable, unlike bus and trolleybus stops where everything also depends on whether the driver arrives at the stop correctly. The tram doesn't pollute the air because it is powered by electric motors. This improves the comfort and quality of life in the city and has a positive impact on the health of residents. Of course, the source of electricity also plays a role here. For example, if it's a coal-fired power plant, there will be pollution, but if the electricity for trams comes from renewable sources, it's ideal for the environment and climate protection. Besides, tram tracks can be laid among grass or other greenery. First, it makes street look nicer, and secondly, greenery heats up less in the sun than asphalt or paving stones and can absorb rainwater, making the street more comfortable and resistant to climate change. Also, a tram has a much higher energy efficiency. Electric motors are generally more efficient than internal combustion engines, and in addition to this, a tram runs on metal wheels over metal rails, which creates less rolling resistance than rubber wheels on asphalt or especially cobblestones. So with other things equal, a tram requires less energy to move than a bus or a trolleybus. As a result, transportation of each passenger is less energy expensive, so on a citywide scale, using trams can save a lot of energy compared to trolleybuses and electric buses, and even more so when compared to private cars. According to all mentioned before, rail transport in general and trams in particular are statistically the safest form of ground transportation. The probability of being injured or killed in an accident while riding a tram is significantly lower than when driving a car. Another important thing is that the tram is generally quite durable. Of course, you can break anything if you want to, but trams have a very high strength margin. If they are well maintained, they can serve for decades, and the world is full of examples of such long livers. Vienna, Rome, Lisbon, Prague, Gothenburg, these are just the first ones that came to mind. At the same time, a 50-year-old tram remains as environmentally friendly as a new one. And this is not the case with buses though. Their internal combustion engines wear out much more and needs extensive maintenance, filter replacement and a lot of other spare parts. In addition, they become morally obsolete with the introduction of new environmental standards, and it turns out that a fully functional bus can't operate on a route because it doesn't meet that new standards. Electric buses also have their own issues with battery life, which lose capacity over the years and need to be replaced. You can find out more about this in this video. Also, thanks to the rails, trams are easier to navigate for passengers, which is especially valuable for tourists and visitors. Tram can't suddenly turn the wrong way, and when you get on it, you feel more confident that you are going exactly where you need to go. Tram rails will always guide you to the stop and are generally an additional landmark on city streets, even if you are just walking. And I suppose lots of people used to explain the way to someone by saying something like walk along the tram tracks and then turn left at the horse monument. It happened, wasn't it? Also, laying a tram line shows that city officials are paying attention to development of the area and can stimulate neighborhood growth and business activity. On the other hand, a bus route can appear quickly and disappear just as quickly, so it is not very suitable for a long-term planning. But if the city invests in a tram, it will stay for a long time and you can rely on it more confidently, unless you live in Kujava, of course. A good example of this is the Swedish city of Lund, where after the launch of a new tram line, business interest in investing in new construction projects increased significantly as real estate prices along the line grew by an average of 25%. After the launch of tram, the city quickly sold the previously unused plots for development and in this way recovered the funds spent on the tram line. And now real estate development along the line is expected to create 40,000 new residents and jobs over the next 30 years. Trams also have one hidden superpower that is rarely mentioned or used, but which can bring a lot of benefits. I mean the cargo transportation inside the city. In fact, tram is a small railway and its metal rails can handle much more weight than a regular asphalt or pavement. In addition, a modern tram has dedicated lanes and its rails always turn smoothly and laid in such a way that large trams fit even on narrow streets. That means trams can carry not only passengers but also cargo. To be honest, there are not so many such examples in the world, but they exist. The most well-known is probably the cargo tram from Dresden, Germany, which was used to deliver parts to the local Volkswagen factory and operated for almost 20 years. Its total length was almost 60 meters and it could carry about 60 tons of cargo. Another example is from the Swiss city of Zurich, where they decided to use their extensive tram network to transport recyclable waste. Garbage containers are placed at the special sites throughout the city, and from time to time a freight tram with platforms comes to pick them up and take to the recycling center. And to launch this system, they needed to build just small branches from the main track. And this is the Rätische, a narrow-gauge railway in Switzerland that has street sections which are used by both passenger and freight trains. Of course, this is not a regular tram, but it also shows the potential capabilities of street rails very well. And now let's talk a little bit about the downsides of trams. The tram can't go around obstacles. It is what it is. An accident on the tracks or just an improperly parked car can stop tram traffic and cause trouble for thousands of passengers. However, this problem can be minimized by proper street planning, maximum separation of tram tracks from car traffic, and priority at intersections. In this regard, a good example is the railway, where trains also also travel on rails, but stops because of accidents are very rare. Also, a good tram network should be fairly extensive and have detour or turnaround options for such cases to avoid situations where all routes meet on one street and an accident on it stops the entire network. Because tramline construction is relatively complicated and expensive, everything has to start with good planning. Of course, this is not a direct disadvantage, because you'd better plan every such a project, but that's a thing you must take into account so that later you don't face annoying mistakes that will be very difficult and expensive to fix. And now let's make a smart face and try to draw some conclusions. In general, tram is the most capable type of public transport which runs directly on the streets without building mega expensive tunnels and overpasses. And the important thing is that it has a huge potential for development, as it can be constantly upgraded to a pretty advanced level that will allow solving a complex tasks in terms of urban mobility. Of course, the tram isn't almighty though, but more capable things such as metro or urban railways are much more expensive and difficult to implement. And this is crucial to understand for cities which are considering to close their tram systems and build a subway instead, which should magically solve their transportation problems. Because if you can't manage a tram and make it work efficiently, then it's quite naive to hope that the subway will work exactly as it should. Everything will be essentially the same, but with much higher costs. For example, construction of a 10-kilometer metro line will cost an average of 1 to 2.5 billion euros. For the same amount of money, you can build from 50 to 250 kilometers of tram tracks on city streets, which means a highly branched system with many routes and the possibility of transfers between them. At the same time, a single metro line on the scale of a large city will not bring fundamental changes, since most of the city will not have access to it anyway. To feel the real effect, you need a whole system with many lines and transfer stations that will cover most of the city and allow you to move freely around it. And this requires tens of billions and decades of complex construction work. Of course, there are different situations and some cities really can do without a metro, but the decisions should be based on clear and rational calculations, not just because every metropolis should have a metro system. And even if some cities really can't do without the subway, a modern tram could be a great help in creating efficient public transportation systems. And this should be the basis of every developed modern city.